Kita mulakan pertemuan pada pagi ini membaca kitab Al-Fatihah. Alhamdulillah kita dapat menyambung kembali kita punya kita panggil sebagai metodologi mutakalimun. Ni basically kita cuba menggabungkan antara secara lebih besar agama dengan sains, ya. Sikit kita cakap Islam dengan sains. Tapi saya fikir sebab kita mengambil satu metodologi khusus yang kita sebut kalam, yang saya fikir berbanding dengan tradisi besar dalam Islam, misalnya falsafah, tasawuf, kalam ni yang lebih analytical dan lebih rasional, ya. Dan di segi pendekatannya pun memang kalam bermula dengan logik. Dia logik dan scientific method tu dia punya kalam 101 punya kata orang kurikulum sebelum kita pergi kalam proper, ya. Yang misalnya akan dibincang oleh Dr. Irwan pada pagi inilah. Jadi itu sebenarnya kita tekankan kalam dengan sains. Dan ini pun dah siri ke-8 ya, 7 ke-8. Dan alhamdulillah Dr. Irwan sangat konsisten dengan kita. Dia yang pertama beliau ada, ya. Kita adakan tiap-tiap bulan, ya. Pada mulanya kita lebih membuat secara kecilan sajalah, kita pun tak open to public. Setelah ada permintaan kita bukalah, ya. Apa yang saya sekadar sedikit introduction sebelum saya buat serah kepada Irwan. Kita mendapati perbincangan antara sains dengan Islam, dan khususnya dalam konteks kita kalam ni memang tidak menjadi subjek yang menjadi perhatian mesti, ya. Dan saya fikir sebab itu kita kena gerakkan perbincangan ini. Dan kita juga mendapati kalam punya approach kepada nature, pada alam ni lebih mirip dengan modern science, ya. Saya ambil contoh antara assumption yang paling besar dalam modern science ialah alam ni bersifat atomistik, ya. Itu dah macam kita anggap receive view lah, ya. Alam ni bersifat kuanta ni, bersifat small particle discrete ni memang yang diterima oleh saintis juga, dan mereka pun telah bukti sebagai benar, kan. Jadi itu assumption yang juga dalam kalam, dan memang dalam kalam malah idea dipanggil jauhar dengan arat ini memang sebahagian daripada setengah mutakalimun, enggak sebagian daripada dia punya akidah gitu, ya. Jadi maksudnya itu menunjukkan bahawa kalam punya teori ni mirip dengan modern science. Dan yang kedua, misalnya kalam juga berpegang kepada tidak ada causation ataupun sebab musabab yang wajib dalam alam ini. Dan ini pun diterima dalam modern science pada hari ini, ya. Maknanya alam ini bersifat indeterministic, ya. Tidak ada necessary causation, ya, between cause and effect. Dan ini pun salah satu daripada pillars kalam yang jelas diambil oleh Hume misalnya. Bulan lepas saudara orang bincang mengenai Hume, ya. Maknanya Hume maknanya mengakui bahawa tidak ada sebab musabab yang wajib dalam alam, melainkan apa yang Hume panggil sebagai habit of mind, ya. Kan, sebagai minda kita punya adat atau convention. Sedangkan dalam Islam kita sebut habit of God, maknanya sebagai sunatullah, ya, segi hubungan ni, ya. Kemudian yang mungkin lebih metafizik itu ialah idea nominalism, ya. Dalam kalam kita punya metafizik itu saya sebut sangat thin, ya, mean and lean, ya. Kita tak ada thick metafizik, ya. Kalau saudara biasa dengan Ibn Sina, dia punya metafizik sangat thick, ya. Ataupun saudara biasa dengan Ibn Arabi, Faris tahu, dia punya metafizik itu sangat thick, ya, sangat tebal. Tapi bagi kalam dia punya metafizik itu sangat minimum, ya. Jadi ini antara sebab mengapa kita fikir kalam ni lebih serasi dengan pemikiran modern science, ya. yang perlu kita interaksikan, perlu kita engagekan, perlu kita mungkin menyumbang sesuatu, ya. Sebab mereka pun mengambil kualitas kita juga. Akhirnya begitu. Jadi itu tujuan utama kita mengadakan pembicaraan ini. Dan pada pagi ini alhamdulillah kita bertuah mendapat Dr. Irwan, ya. Sengaja pada tim poster, ya. Dia punya tu background sedikit. Dia seorang microbiologist dari UPM dan dia akan membincang tentang Syairah, ya, Cartesian, Descartes yang dianggap sebagai pengasas falsafah moden dan juga membantu membina sains moden, dan Occasionalism, ya. Occasionalism inilah juga sumbangan ilmu kalam, ya. Makna Occasionalism ini menyebut bahawa tidak ada inherent power dalam objek. Ini berbeza dengan ahli falsafah, ya. Bagi ahli falsafah, kalau semasa Greek dahulu, dalam objek itu ada inherent power, ya. Iaitu dia menjadi sebab-sebab tu ditentukan oleh objek A. Misalnya objek A menyebabkan objek B, dia ada hubungan. Bagi mutakalimun, semua objek ini disebut sebagai inert. Maknanya tak ada apa-apa, kosong, ya, inert. Dan ini pun sumbangan kalam yang jelas bagi modern science. Sebab modern science pun berkira macam tu, objek ni just inert, just mechanical punya arrangement, kan, yang menggerakkan mereka. Dan ini juga sumbangan yang saya boleh anggap revolutionary dari kalam kepada pemikiran manusia. Sebab sebelum kalam, dari falsafah Islam memang terpengaruh bahawa di alam ini, objek-objek ini ada dia punya power yang tersendiri, inherent, ya. Dalam Mu'tazilah disebut sebagai idea tawalud itu. Maknanya objek itu ada dia punya kita panggil power. Aristotle disebut sebagai potential ataupun actuality, potentiality. Kalam itu tak vibe beside dia. Bagi kalam, semua objek dalam dunia ini tidak ada kuasa, tidak ada power, ya. Itu konsep kita la haula wala quwata illa billah tu. Semuanya Tuhan gerakkan pada setiap instant. Itu ada occasion, ya. Occasion ni maksudnya pada setiap event tu Allah jadikan. Tidak ada. Ghazali memberi contoh yang paling empirikal bahawa api itu tidak membakar, ya. Okay, basically dia punya analogi yang Ghazali itu dan diikut oleh falsafah barat kemudian. Bila api membakar tu, katakan api dengan kain, bukan api yang membakar kain. Maknanya benda itu berlaku serentak, ya. Maknanya Allah menciptakan api dan menciptakan kain terbakar. Sebab tujuan utama Ghazali menerangkan ni lah untuk menunjukkan bahawa mukjizat itu boleh berlaku, ya. Sebab api tidak saja membakar, kan, dalam kes Nabi Ibrahim. Jadi ini antara hal-hal yang sebenarnya saintifik tetapi berkaitan dengan agama, dengan akidah. Dan ini sebenarnya sifat ilmu kalam yang saya rasa penting untuk kita fahami. Dia mengukuhkan kita punya akidah dan sama untuk membuang syubhah ataupun kekeliruan ataupun macam deceit, kan, oleh ideologi ataupun pandangan. Jadi itu sekadar ringkasan pada yang ni. Mungkin yang saya belum kenal, mungkin boleh perkenalkan diri lah. Yang dari mana, nama?
Saya Ahmad Abidin.
Ahmad Abidin. Dari mana?
Belajar
sekarang ni dah habis?
Tak
cuti. Tahun berapa? Tinggal buat program?
Perubatan.
Okey. Terima kasihlah datang. Sebelah.
Saya ni Alida, orang daripada Ampang.
Oh, okey. Terima kasihlah datang.
Okay. Bagus yang mak anak datang.
Saya Amran Muhammad. Saya juga dari Universiti Azhar. Belajar perubatan.
Okey.
Bagus tu.
Yang barulah, yang lain tu saya jenis familiar lah, insyaAllah. Kami Dr. Fairul first time.
Fairul Nizam dari UPM.
Syarah di sana. Sebelah dia.
Introduce yourself.
Muaida Adam Irwan Hanish. Master in Psychology.
Okey. Okey, silakan.
Okay. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. So, Assalamualaikum. So, thank you for being here. So the text that we're going to go through today is a chapter of a book by Dr. Nazif Muhtaroglu. So he's a Turkish scholar. So he did his PhD in Islamic and Cartesian Occasionalism. So this is pretty much his field of expertise. So if you are interested in learning about occasionalism, you should really check him out. So the title of this, it has 3 words. We have Ash'arites, Cartesians, and Occasionalism. So I'm going to briefly describe these words quickly as a preparation for us to go through the rest of the text. Right, so the Ash'arites is the dominant school of theology, dominant school of Kalam. So when I first started learning about Kalam, I thought it's only about interpreting the verses of the Quran or the narration of the Hadith about the nature of God, and that's it. But now, at this point, after I learned a lot from Dr. Amran, who I consider my teacher, Kalam is much more expansive than that. So I think of it as an analytical branch of our theology, and it tries to construct rational positions for the things that we Muslims believe in, not just the things that we believe about God, but also what we believe about reality and about what we believe about the scientific nature. So that's Ash'arite. So I'm going to use the word Ash'arite and Mutakallimun interchangeably because in this context they kind of mean the same thing. So that's the Ash'arites. So the Cartesians. So the Cartesians are the scholars who studied and developed the ideas of René Descartes. So Descartes is a scientist and a philosopher from France. So the reason as a science student I'm interested to learn about the Cartesians is because the way we conduct science today is very much dependent on the way the Cartesians developed the way of looking at the world. I'll give you an example. So as a scientist, you can go into the lab, you do some experiments, and then you can take the results of the experiment and you can show it to the scientific community, right? So if I were to do that before the Cartesians, the scientific community would reject it because they will say, well, we cannot know nature by doing experiments, because when you do experiments, you're doing it in a very controlled environment. It's an artificial environment. You cannot get understanding of what's natural from the artificial. But after the Cartesians, that's changed. So the Cartesians allow for the experimentation as a source of knowledge to understand about nature. So that's why it's very interesting to learn about the Cartesians. And then the third word here is occasionalism. So like Dr. Amran briefly described, hopefully we can understand more about occasionalism by the end of this talk. But briefly for now, occasionalism means that all creations do not have power to change anything. All creations do not have power to change anything. The only agent, the only being that can cause anything is God. So that's occasionalism. Now, so in this chapter, we are trying to address 2 questions. So question number 1 is, what are the similarities between the Cartesians and the Mutakallimun in terms of their ideas about reality? Okay? And the second question what we want to address is, how did the ideas of the Mutakallimun could have reached the Cartesians in Western Europe? So the first question, what are the similarities between the Ash'arites and the Cartesians in terms of their metaphysics? So we can divide this into 4 different concepts. We have causality, modality, laws of nature, and atomism. Okay? So in terms of causality, when we talk about the Cartesians' view of causality, how are things caused by another thing? We can divide them into 2. So we can, the first type is limited occasionalism. The second type is thoroughgoing or full occasionalism. So to understand the difference between these 2, we have to step back and try to look at the foundation of the Cartesian thought, which is the substance dualism. So according to Descartes, all creations, you can reduce them into two substances. You have body and you have mind. So body is anything that extend in space. So all the physical objects that you're looking at right now, they are considered bodies in the Cartesian dualism. So what about the mind? The mind is the opposite. The mind is immaterial objects that doesn't occupy the three-dimensional space, right? So you think of thoughts. So even though your thoughts have these neural correlates in your brain, but the thought itself doesn't occupy physical space. And also another example is the soul, right? So the soul is not considered part of the material existence. So now that we understand the difference between body and mind, we can understand that the Cartesians have two types of occasionalism. So the limited occasionalism says that the mind has the power to cause a change, but the body doesn't. So that's the limited occasionalism. So this view is held by Descartes himself. But other Cartesians, such as Géraud de Courdemois and Nicolas Malebranche, they believe in the full occasionalism. So they believe that both the mind and the body do not have the power to cause any change. Okay? So in that sense, the full occasionalists are the ones who have similar ways of looking at causality when we compare them to the mutakallimun. Because people like Al-Ghazali, for example, he's trying to counter the ideas of the Aristotelians, because there is like what Dr. Amran said, the Aristotelians, students of Aristotle, they believe that the objects themselves have the ability to cause something. But Al-Ghazali doesn't believe so. He says that fire doesn't have to burn the cloth if they come in contact. So the way to understand this, the one that's helpful for me is something that Sheikh Hamza Yusuf mentioned. He says, think of it like a movie, right? So if you have a movie and you try to look at, for example, 1 second of a movie, and your experience visually is that you have like this one image that's moving for 1 second, right? So, but in reality, that's not what's happening. In reality, what you have is 24 still images going one after another, right? So one frame doesn't actually cause the existence for the second frame. They are both actually generated by your GPU, your graphic processing unit, right? So they don't have power to cause each other. So similarly, in reality, in daily life, when you experience an event as a continuous event, it's just your experience. In reality, each of the moment of your experience is generated by God independently of each other. And just like the editor, the cinematographer, they can actually switch one frame of a movie with another frame, that they can change the scene of a movie. So too can God change the moment of your daily experience. So nothing in the world can actually cause something else unless God allows it to do so. So like Dr. Amran said, La hawla wa la quwwata illa billah. There is nothing can change, nothing can cause, nothing have the ability to transform, nothing has the ability to, the power to change anything except by God. So that's the causality, the similarities in terms of causality between the Cartesians and the mutakallimun. So the second concept is the concept of modality. So modality is about what could be or what must be. It's about what's possible and what's necessary. An example of a model statement would be, we are all here sitting in this room learning about kalam and science. So that's a possibility. It's not necessary, because it is possible we could have been somewhere else. We could have been in a restaurant having breakfast together, right? So that's another model statement that has the status of possibility. Now, a statement that has the status of necessity, you can think of, for example, mathematical truths, right? So if you say 3 times 7 equals 21. So if you understand the definition of 3, you understand the definition of multiplication, you understand the definition of 7, you will end up with 21 and nothing else. So that's a necessary statement. So the Aristotelians, they treat modality differently than how the Cartesians do it. So according to the Aristotelians, they say that modality, possibility, is diachronic. So what they mean by that is something is possible only if it can be actualized in time. Something's possible only if it can be actualized in time. So in contrast to that, the Cartesian says that something is possible if you can conceive it, if you can conceptualize it in your mind, even if you cannot show that it is actualized in time. The example is the mind and body dualism itself. So the Cartesians do not claim that the body and the mind can actually float separately outside in time, in actuality. But they're saying that, but the concept of the concept of body and mind can be analytically separated in our conception of it, right? So we can think of a mind as independent from the body, but in reality, it doesn't mean that they have to be separated. So if you tell that to the Aristotelians, they will say that that's not possible, because for something to be possible, it has to manifest in actual time. Okay? Okay. So in that sense, the Cartesians, they do not the idea of Cartesian synchronic modality, the way the Cartesians treat possibility is different than the way the Aristotelians did. So the Cartesians could not have got the idea from the Aristotelians. But the idea of possibility among the Cartesians, they could have got it from the Mutakallimun, because the Mutakallimun also believes that something is possible even though it doesn't correspond with what you experience in time.
Maybe I can interject here.
Yeah.
This the basic idea of Aristotle, idea of potentiality and actuality. According to Aristotle, bagi Aristotle, benda yang real, benda yang ada dari potential menjadi actual. Sebab itu secara tak langsung menunjukkan dalam benda itu ada power. Potential tu power, ya. Dia punya kuat kan, potential. Kemudian bila jadi actual, dia real. Itu sebenarnya sebut daripada potentiality, potentiality,
Yes.
sebagai benda yang real. Jadi bagi Aristotle tidak ada possible world. Tapi bagi kalam dia possible. That's why dia ada modality ni datang pada syair. Model mana possible world yang mungkin tak ada dekat luar, tapi kita boleh conceive dekat punya mind, possible world. Dan ini penting dalam syairah, sebab syairah ada konsep kemungkinan, possible, modality. Mana ada yang wajib, ada yang mustahil, dan ada yang mustahil. Jadi ada contingency ni sangat penting dalam syairah punya tim. Dan apa yang Dr. Wan cakap, Ini yang kita cuba bezakan dengan Aristotle. Sebab bagi Aristotle yang real tu mesti yang boleh di-actualize.
Yes.
Tapi bagi Asyairah ada benda yang sebab itu ini pun berkaitan dengan akidah kita. Tuhan boleh jadikan kita banyak dalam banyak kemungkinan. Tapi Allah jadi pilih untuk jadi kita yang kita inilah. Tapi sebenarnya Allah ada banyak kemungkinan untuk menjadikan kita. Ini yang apa itu yang ahli falsafah bertentangan dengan Asyairah itu.
Yeah.
Jadi ini penting sebenarnya dalam perbincangan kalam ya. Maknanya ada kemungkinan God boleh menciptakan banyak possibility yang tak mestinya real. Tapi bagi ahli falsafah, apa yang Tuhan ciptakan itulah yang real. Maknanya tidak mungkin Tuhan cipta possible. Jadi ni saya cuba interject sikit.
Yes, fine, it's fine. Maybe I should use like an example to clarify the point. So imagine you have a block of glass, right? So the block of glass has the potentiality to be a laptop screen. Okay, so the block of glass has a potentiality to be a laptop screen. So the Aristotelians would say that therefore it is possible for the block of glass to be the laptop screen. But if I have a block of wood, right, the block of wood doesn't have the potentiality to be a laptop screen. So the Aristotelians then will say it is not possible for the block of wood to be a laptop screen. So that's their position. But according to the Cartesians and according to the Mutakallimun, that's not true. Al-Ghazali says that the notion of possibility is not inherent in the object themselves. The possibility is a judgment of the scientists, of the mind who think about these things. So according to the Mutakallimun, it is possible for the block of wood to be a laptop screen. It's just we don't have the fabrication technology to make that to happen yet. See the difference? Okay?
Ini penting because ini antara kritik falsafah terhadap Asyairah atau kalam. Sebab mereka cuba kita panggil buat mockery, apa ni, cuba buat lawak,
fun, yeah.
buat fun. Kata dia bagi dia kalam percaya ini boleh jadi hari ni cawan, besok boleh jadi tikus. Maknanya lusa boleh jadi orang. Ini maksudnya possible. Tetapi bagi kita Allah menjadikan apa aja, kan? Sebab kita punya kalam Asyairah punya pegangan. Satu benda Allah boleh jadikan apa pun kalau Allah nak, betul? Mungkin hari ni saya nampak gelas, besok jadi tikus, besok jadi apa benda lain, kan? Possible.
Yeah.
Tapi bagi falsafah Aristotle tak boleh. Kalau gelas ni gelas je lah. Dan kalau dia jadi pun benda yang berkaitan dengan dia. Nampak tak dia punya beza? Itu masuk potentiality dan actuality bagi dia. Macam tu Dr. Wan beritahu, gelas mungkin boleh jadi laptop, kan? Sebab ada silikon, ada whatever lah.
Yes.
Tapi kayu tak boleh jadi laptop sebab dia punya composition chemical dia lain, kan? Tapi bagi Asyairah, there is nothing impossible to God actually. That the trust or the idea modality ni. Tidak ada something yang impossible to God kecuali yang kontradik dengan logik dia tak. Ada juga dia punya clause.
Yes.
Menunjukkan Asyairah ni dia konsisten untuk rasional. Semua God buat, semua Allah boleh jadikan, tapi kecuali yang bertentangan dengan logik.
Tentangan benda yang mustahil.
Dengan mustahil. Misalnya biasa dia contoh apa? Tuhan beranak misalnya, kan? Tuhan ada anak. Boleh je, tapi itu mustahil. Satu yang mustahil lah. Ataupun Tuhan mencipta satu yang dia tak boleh angkat misalnya. Itu biasa dalam buku-buku kalam, ya. Jadi idea utama Asyairah di sini, dan tingkat mungkin follow, ya, bahawa there is possibility of thing tu can happen at any moment. Tapi bagi falsafah dia dah limitkan possibility tu. Tapi dia buat apa, dia lawakkan ataupun dia macam menyimbing. Jadi bagi dia Asyairah ni Tuhan dia disebut kadang-kadang sebagai fickle minded ataupun capricious God, ya. Ini cara dia orang cuba, saya fikir, membuat mockery pada Tuhan Asyairah ni. Tuhan kita ni fickle minded, sekejap jadi ni. Padahal itu ada sunatullah. Walaupun possible bagi Tuhan untuk menjadikan apa pun, tetapi sunatullah tu dah semacam menjadi habit of God, dah jadi macam adat bagi Allah menjadikan itu konsisten. Sebab Ali Falsafah cakap tidak mungkin Allah jadikan sesuatu tu kalau dia tak ada dia punya apa tu, dia punya inherent power dekat benda. Jadi ini idea modality ni I think very crucial dalam falsafah dan Asy'ariyah menyumbang besar dalam isu ni ya. So boleh pick up tak idea modality ni yang tadi orang cuba pegang.
Okay, so that's how the Cartesians treat the possibility. When it comes to the necessary, the Cartesians, they kind of have the split, right? So some of them says that all necessary truths are subject to divine will. It means that if God wanted, He could have made 3 times 7 equals 21. Right? He could have made triangle to have 7 corners, 7 edges. So that's the position of some of the Cartesians. But other Cartesians, such as Melbourne, he says that necessary truths are outside of divine will, and that is more consistent with the view of the Mutakallimun, because the Mutakallimun doesn't put the impossible and the necessary as part of divine will. It means that you cannot ask, can God create something greater than He is? The answer is no, not because God is incapable, it's just because the question is wrong. The question is positing something that is metaphysically impossible. Therefore, we cannot answer yes to that question. Similarly, God cannot make all bachelors to be married, because the definition of bachelors is unmarried people. You see? Alright, so that's the similarity and differences between the Cartesians and the Mutakallimun in terms of modality. So the third aspect is laws of nature. So Descartes introduces several statements to describe mathematically the interactions between bodies. Okay? So he calls this laws of nature. And these laws of nature are decrees of God. He says that God gives orders to nature to behave regularly like this. So this way of looking at the world, he couldn't have gotten it from the Aristotelians, because according to the philosophers, the Aristotelians, regularities in nature is not universal, right? So because they believe that there are different elements between different levels of the universe. So on Earth we have 4 elements, fire, air, earth, water. But outside in the space we have, I think, something called ether. So it's a different element. So because of that, they can't say that natural phenomena will behave the same way on Earth and in space. So it's different than the way Cartesians envision laws of nature. So since Descartes didn't get it from the Aristotelians, he also he could have got these ideas from the Mutakallimun, because according to the Mutakallimun, the regularities that you observe in natural phenomena is simply sunnatullah, is the custom of God, and because of that it is universal. God could have made the regularities of nature everywhere, and this is vital for the scientists, because they have, every time they do experiments, they only work on a very small samples, and in order for them to claim that these results is applicable to the larger scale, they have to accept this possibility, or they have to accept this position that laws of nature is regular and laws of nature is universal. Alright? Now, So that's the similarity between mutakallimun and the Cartesians. However, at some point there's a difference. For example, Descartes himself, he says that this laws of nature that is decreed by God is immutable. It means that the regularities of scientific observations that we see, it cannot change because God doesn't change, right? So the ideas of gravity or mitosis, it will always be like that all the time. So the question is, what about miracles that people experience? What about the prophetic miracles? What about, the cancer patients who experience spontaneous remission when the cancer suddenly gone? So how do you explain that according to Descartes? The other Cartesians, Malebranche, he answers that by dividing God's decrees into two types. One is general volitions. The second one is particular volitions. Volitions means the power of using one's will. Think of it like a choice. So according to Malebranche, God has the general choice of making things regular. But from time to time, he can suspend that regularity and create something that, from our perspective, miraculous. Okay? So this position, that God has ability to allow for suspension of natural regularities, is something that we can accept easily, because the mutakallimun believes that the natural consistency that we observe in the world is simply a custom of God, a habit. And at any time, God can stop that custom and make it into something else. So here we see the similarities again between the Cartesians and the mutakallimun in terms of laws of nature. Okay? Right, so the fourth one is atomism. Sure.
Idea ni penting, idea of nature ni. Memang dalam falsafah kita panggil ilmu tabi'i ya. Kalau dalam falsafah biasanya dia akan mulakan dengan mantik, kemudian tabi'iyat, maksudnya nature, our understanding in nature, tabi'iyat, kemudian baru matematik, riyadiyat ya, riyadah. Actually matematik ni sebenarnya exercise, that's why they call riyadah. Hari ni disebut riyadah ya, ini mathematics. And the last one baru metaphysics ya. The word tabi'iyat itu dia understand tabak ni maksudnya something be imprinted. That's why bila dia cakap law of nature is God decree, as if Tuhan imprint dekat nature ni dia punya undang-undang. Itu yang kita understand sebagai sunatullah ya. That basically the word tabak itu maksudnya print, something kita cetak kan, kita print. Jadi kita kena bayangkan seolah di alam ini law of nature ni semacam Tuhan punya cetakan ya, secara abstrak tu. Bagi ahli falsafah, bila God imprint tabi'iyah itu, pada tabiat itu ada dia punya power. This is what I mean by inherent power. Seolah Tuhan dah delegate power pada tabi'i. Itu kan ya. Tapi bagi mutakallimun, God tak delegate power. God still retain the power tu. Walaupun dia dah imprint law of nature, but the power still belong to him. Ini dia idea dalam occasionalism. Bagi ahli falsafah, dianggap God dah delegate power pada nature itself. So this sometimes kita panggil secondary causation ya. Bagi Asy'ariyah tak ada secondary ni. Semuanya masih God retain the power to the nature to operate. Ini beza antara kalam dengan ahli falsafah ya. Sebab bagi ahli falsafah, bila God imprint tabak the nature itu dipanggil tabi'at, nature itu sendiri ada dia punya own now power ataupun privilege ataupun dia punya authority. Bagi Asy'ariyah, the power still retain with God. Sebab itu tabi'ah ni masih lagi kosong, tak ada apa pun. Melainkan kalau God gerakkan boleh gerak ya. Tapi the basic sunatullah tu dah ada dah ya. Ini yang membezakan antara ahli falsafah dengan Asy'ariyah. Maknanya Asy'ariyah memang konsisten pada mengatakan Tuhan itu segala-galanya Ini kadang-kadang disalahfahami seolah manusia ini tidak ada apa kuasa kan. Timbullah dia Mu'tazilah ataupun Qadariyah, ataupun orang menuduh syariat ini menjadi fatalistik kan, pasrah, semuanya serah pada Tuhan. Itu bukan maksud bila Asy'ariyah mengatakan semuanya pada Allah, kita tak ada kuasa, tidak ada usaha ya. Tapi ini menunjukkan bahawa Allah tu yang kudrah tu semata-mata dari Allah. Hatta bila dikasih kita kuasa pun sebagai semacam loan aja kan, loan aja sebagai apa dia panggil idea kasar ya, quiet power kudrah. Ini penting, law of nature. Dan saya ingat ini pun penting sebab Asy'ariyah yang pertama menekan idea law of nature. Sebab bagi Aristotle, alam ni ada dua nature, dua kategori. Satu dipanggil superlunary world yang above bumi, dan satu panggil sublunary world. Dia operate dalam dua law. Hanya setelah Galileo baru dia percaya alam ni satu. Nampak? Tahun itu Galileo 1600 lebih kurang, 1600 lepas Kopernikan. Galileo lepas Kopernikan 1600 baru falsafah tahu bahawa alam ni sama je satu alam. Sebelum ni dianggap alam ni ada dua sempadan ni. Iaitu yang ether tu macam dia punya border dia lah ya. Jadi dunia dia punya operation lain, yang above bulan tu dia panggil supralunary lain. Sebab bagi mereka di sanalah letaknya fixed star kan, panggil fixed star kan. Jadi yang hanya dunia lah ada corruption dengan generation dia panggil. Inilah Aristotle punya fizik ya. Paris kalau tahu, kalau pernah belajar dia bagi macam tu. Setelah Galileo bila dia nampak teleskop tu pun dia nampak bahawa bulan tu ada kan, ada kawah, rasa pun tengok dia punya cerita lah kan. Bahawa di bulan tu ada apa kereta, kawah. Bahawa bulan ni pun sama juga macam di bumi. Nampak? Baru idea tu dipanggil law of nature ni sekali. Kita tak mereka asingkan macam tu tuan cakap tu. Maknanya ada law yang lokal, kemudian law yang untuk dipanggil untuk fixed star ya. Dan kalau dalam Greek punya idea, di fixed star ni lah ada angel, ada God, macam tu lah, that safety. Tapi Asy'ariyah daripada awal tidak membahagikan ni, kosmologi ni pada dua bahagian ya. Ini pun benda yang penting. Descartes baru antara yang awal ya. Setelah Descartes mereka baru melihat bahawa ada law of nature yang universal ya. Dan mereka tak akan dapat daripada Aristotle. Dan alternatif memang dapat pada Asy'ariyah ya.
Right. So another implication of the things that Dr. Amran said is that we can apply that idea in our daily life, because sometimes we feel like we put too much effort on something and things that doesn't turn out to be the way that we want it to be, and sometimes that can get very, very frustrating. So that can only be frustrating if you really believe that your effort is the thing that caused the results. But in our Aqidah, that's not the case. Whatever we do, we always have to depend on God to make that results to happen. Right? That's how I use that idea in my own life. Okay? So that's laws of nature. Number 4, you have atomism. Now, here's a tip. If you want to talk to science students about atomism, you have to clarify that the philosophical atom is actually different than the physical atom. Because if you just say atom to them, they will think of like that particle that have neutrons and protons. But that's not what the Mutakallimun are referring to. So when the Mutakallimun talks about atom, they're talking about the most elemental unit of substance. So if you have an object and you keep breaking it down, you're going to get to a point where there's a unit that you cannot divide anymore, right? So that's the philosophical atom. Now, in the past, the philosophical atom and the physical atom could have been the same thing, because people in the past, scientists in the past, think that atom is the smallest unit there is. But later they found out that atom has something smaller than that. They have protons. And then later on they found out that protons have the subunits too. They have quarks, right? So whatever happens in the physical world, it doesn't change the definition of the philosophical atom. So in that case, I guess up to this point, when we talk about a philosophical atom, we'll very likely refer to quarks at this stage of our understanding of physical atom. Okay? Is that clear?
Dan I think here we need to make qualifications sebab the Asy'ariyah itu tidak panggil atom. Asy'ariyah sendiri tak panggil atom. Dia panggil jauhar dengan a'rad.
Right.
Jauhar. Jauhar that mean substance, yeah. Substance macam a'rad. A'rad is accident. It's more like qualities. As if you have some substance, your core thing, then the properties. A'rad is properties, color, but substance. So they call jauhar a'rad, and it's more like we said there is discrete thing, discrete
elemental thing, yeah.
Even they call al-juz allazi yatajazza, thing that cannot be divided. They never call atom. So we must avoid people ridiculing Asy'ariyah. Say, oh, now kita dah tak ada atom, kita dah panggil quark. No. Asy'ariyah tak pernah cakap atom. Yang dicakap adalah satu yang paling kecil yang tidak boleh dipecahkan. Ini what people know, maybe quark, whatever, the smallest thing. Tapi the whole idea, Asy'ariyah percaya alam ini daripada partikular yang bersifat atomistik ini, ya, ataupun corpuscular something kita panggil, ya. It's still valid. Jadi saya rasa kita tak boleh kita must respond quickly bahawa atom ini bukan atom dalton tu. Sebab basic atom ni kan, atom dalton tu kan tahun 50-an 70-an tu kan. Jadi Asy'ariyah cakap alam ini daripada partikel yang halus yang tidak boleh kita pecahkan. It's still valid kalau gunakan idea juzuk yang tidak boleh lagi dipecahkan. Ataupun paling lebih generik, alam daripada discrete ataupun bersifat kuanta. Dia boleh ada quantum, dia discrete macam pocket tinggal discrete. Kenapa? Sebab ahli falsafah percaya alam ini daripada block universe.
So I was surprised when I read this that the Cartesians actually reject atomism. They don't believe that there is a smallest discrete unit in the world, and they also, majority of them also reject the existence of vacuum. They don't believe that vacuum exists. But when I read about it, I understand why they think that way. Because remember I talk about bodies and mind. So how do you define bodies if you are a Cartesian? Bodies is something that extend in space. It's something that occupies space. So space doesn't have its own existence. Space is simply an attribute, a principal attribute of bodies. So if God were to remove all bodies from the universe, there is no vacuum, there is no space left, because space is not an independent existence. So that's what they think about. They think about space. It's very interesting. So most Cartesians follow this line of thought, except this scholar called Cordemois. So Cordemois believed that no, you can divide matter, but you cannot divide bodies. So he make a distinction between body and matter. So body is that thing that extend in space. Matters are the aggregation of bodies. Therefore, you can break down matters as much as you want. But at some point, you're going to reach body, which is not divisible. So in that sense, he is following the ideas of the mutakallimun, who believes in atom, in the belief in atomism. So that's about the atomism of substance. But what about the atomism of time? Can we actually cut down time to the smallest unit where you cannot where you cannot divide them anymore? So in this regards, the Cartesians say yes. they believe in time atomism, and that is consistent with the mutakallimun. And an interesting thing about time atomism is, because they believe that time can be separated moment to moment to moment, they believe that the existence of things in one moment doesn't guarantee the existence of the same thing in the next moment. So preservation doesn't occur across time. So the reason we can still have existence in more than one time atom, more than one moment, is because the creative power that creates the object in the first moment also creates the object in the second moment. So it's basically what we talk about, how Allah create things moment to moment according to the mutakallimun's idea of occasionalism. Okay? Okay.
Okay,
You
you
want to
agree
say
with
something?
atomism? Okay,
Yeah, atomism. Yeah.
okay, you agree with atomism?
Yes.
Okay. This is important. Kalau kita baca ayat kursi kan, Allah tidak tidur. Mana every moment Allah menciptakan. That the whole basis mutakallimun punya reference. Maknanya sebab itu the idea of hal-kun jadi itu, this is basically kalam punya kind of teori yang penting juga. Nampak tak dekat dia pening sikit kan? That's why this how thinking influence people. Part dia cuba ambil Asy'ariyah, part dia masih kekal Aristotle. You see? What Aristotle believe, Dr. Irwan cakap, they don't believe vacuum, right?
Yeah.
Aristotle dia punya maxim, nature abhor vacuum. Sebab itu bagi Aristotle, alam ni satu block universe. There's no vacuum. That's why dekat follow body is the extension kan. Jadi bagi Aristotle, alam ini kita panggil is like continuum, ya, continuum, extended body. It's a block universe. Okay. Bila macam tu, there's no vacuum. So Descartes masih follow this idea. Okay. Sedangkan bagi mutakallimun, alam ini is discrete. It's not continuous. Nampak tak? Dia punya different mindset. Ahli falsafah. Tapi kalau kita tengok hari ni, who actually win? Siapa yang lebih betul? Aristotle ke Asy'ariyah? Bisa Asy'ariyah definitely. Because nature is discrete. Dia the whole idea of quantum. Maknanya no scientist akan accept kalau cakap nature ni block universe kan nowadays. It's a standard dalam science. That mean even the West by Descartes pada abad ke-17, 16, 17 ya, masih lagi percaya seperti Aristotle 2000 tahun lepas. Nampak tak? Tapi Asy'ariyah pada awal lagi, even daripada Asy'ari lagi dah percaya atomism ni. Dia abad ke-9, abad 9 ke-10. Then this is very very profound thinking, very scientific. How can you say Asy'ariyah ni tidak scientific? You see people punya accusation tak ada Asy'ariyah. Asy'ariyah ni konservatif, orthodox, kan, traditional, tak scientific. But how people can imagine the world is discrete pada abad ke-9, sedangkan dekat abad ke-16 maksudnya alam ni is block universe, continuum. They call continuum. We tak surprised. I don't know how you're not philosopher. But if you're a philosopher, then you think how radical Asy'ariyah. There is no experiment, there is no lab. Asy'ariyah ni boleh buat reaktor macam CERN ke apa ke. But abad ke-9 lagi dia dah boleh kind of speculate yang alam ni bersifat discrete. Tak ada masalah. You know discrete bersifat atomistik ni. Tapi dekat abad ke-16 masih lagi follow Aristotle, alam ini is continuum, block universe, tak ada vacuum kan. Sebab kalau atom ada vacuum kan, bila ada particle there's a vacuum in between. So this is what we mean by how Asy'ariyah is very very scientific. Even dia tak ada lagi instrument, experiment, yeah. Then at the end of the day, we see that the modern scientific beliefs is like on the Asy'ariyah side. Dan ini yang saya selalu sebut kenapa orang selalu mengangkat siapa ni, Ibn Rushd. You remember kan?
Yes.
As Ibn Rushd is the champion of rationality or science in Islam. This is what people say. Oh, Ibn Rushd lah yang menjadi Barat menjadi maju sains. Actually the West follow the Ash'ari. Dia follow Ibn Rushd, dia akan follow Aristotle. Actually dia reject Aristotle kan, because bagi Ibn Rushd alam masih lagi continue. So I think this someday dalam history yang kita kena, we must take charge, we must explain properly, ya. It's not Ibn Rushd yang Barat ni terima, actually Ash'ari. The idea of atomism up to Hume ambil Ash'ari, so very Ibn Rushd. I couldn't find, saya tak dapat lagi teori Ibn Rushd yang masih dipakai di Barat. Tapi saya dapat Ash'ari punya teori sampai Hume. Dan Hume abad ke-17 gitu. So sometimes we need to explain this to people, sebab kadang-kadang dia macam difitnah bagi Ash'ari kan. Macam inilah Ash'ari. Sebab 20 ni apa sebab 20. But they didn't know that the reasoning behind of this understanding. That means through sifat 20, all this logic, mantik, they come to the conclusion that the world is discrete. Misalnya kan, there is a vacuum, always a vacuum ada ni. Even though you are still following Aristotle, like Ibn Sina, like Ibn Rushd. So people always angkat Ibn Sina. We also respect them, also take their knowledge. Ibn Rushd of course kan. Tapi to pinpoint Ash'ari sebagai penyebab kita tidak maju sains ataupun Ash'ari ini menyebabkan saya tidak berkembang tu, I think dari benda yang kita kena perbaiki, kena betulkan. Okay.
Yeah, that's the point. Okay, so we have addressed the first question. So our first question was, what are the similarities between the Cartesians and the Mutakallimun? And we discovered they have significant similarities in 4 concepts: causality, modality, laws of nature, and atomism. Now the second question is, how did the ideas of the Mutakallimun...
Maybe we can discuss first before second part. If any
Sure. Yes, fine. Do you have any questions about that part?
Afif ni, kamu ini. Sarah, Dr. Masalah. Actually, it's a wacana kan?
Yes.
It's not lecture. Anybody want to ask ataupun tak clear, then boleh tanya lah. Kita berbincang. Ini penting actually, it's a real issue dalam sains. Dan juga saya juga sebenarnya tak suka asingkan apa yang dipanggilkan philosophical atomism dengan real atomism, ya, sebab dia simply masa tu dia tak ada lab, dia tak ada eksperimen, ya. Apa yang dibuat sekarang pun sebab eksperimen tu kadang-kadang endorse apa yang dia dah advertise kan, dia dah buat hipotesis. Dia pun masih speculate, tapi the lab, the experiment allow them. What I want to say here, Ash'ari is very empirical. Kalau kita limit atomism ni sekadar philosophical atomism, nanti kita akan berinteract, you are this philosophy, there is no value. But we want to insist, Ash'ari is very empirical. The reason dia dapat come up with that the atomism ni lah yang akan lebih close dengan empirical evidence kan. That the whole idea, I think. So we cannot easily say Ash'ari need to kind of just philosophical, metaphysical thing. No, they try, they have empirical attitude. That's why they come to the conclusion. Kan? So I think ini penting untuk kita tekankan. Dan dalam sains kita pun tahu actually kebanyakan teori bermula daripada theoretical kan. Dia proof on the lab tu kemudian. Ini ada komen? Paris? Okey.
Sorry, Doktor.
Ya.
Saya terfikir satu je lah mungkin sebab saya punya mindset pun mungkin lebih pada sains. Tapi saya tengok kalau kita tengok daripada perkembangan sejarah tu kan, saya lihat pemikiran Asy'ariyah tu masih lagi bertahan kerana masih lagi disokong oleh justifikasi perubahan dalam sains. Jadi maksudnya cara kita argue Asy'ariyah masih lagi relevan dan sebagainya bergantung juga dengan perkembangan sains.
Ya.
Maksud interpretasi dan sebagainya.
Faham tak? Maksudnya,
Maksudnya,
yang saya faham,
ya.
yang saya faham maksudnya kita kalau boleh kita tak nak letak kekuatan Asy'ariyah tu semata-mata dengan konsistensi dia dengan modern science punya theories.
Ya, tetapi cara kita argue, cara kita menulis, cara untuk kita convince orang lebih kepada itu. Mungkin sebab nature Asy'ariyah kita kata inline dengan Islam. Kita similar juga tu.
Saya rasa okey nak dia punya point tu. Saya rasa kita tak perlu apologetic ataupun defensif. Memang Asy'ariyah is scientific. Because proven. Maknanya because Asy'ariyah, kita dah sebut lalu, Asy'ariyah tak buat banyak spekulasi. Asy'ariyah tak buat macam kosmologi yang kompleks macam Ibn Sina, macam di falsafah kan, dia ada macam tadi kan, ada alam atas bulan, alam bawah bulan, dan dia buat sebagai kosmologi dia macam tu, dia fix kan. Asy'ariyah dia hanya ada minimum metafisik tu. Jadi dia always ada room for flexibility lah. Tapi kalau kita dah bakukan kita punya kosmologi, sains tu berubah, dan kita susah. That's why how Asy'ariyah very close to Quranic spirit juga. Kita punya sikap dalam Quran kan, kita cakap Quran ni bukan buku sains. Dia part daripada dia juga scientific exposure, scientific punya exposure. Tapi this not book of science. Yang dia book Buddha disebut. lebih besar pada book sains. Sains tu macam komponen. Sebab tu kita tak rasa selesa untuk matchkan one to one setiap scientific theory dengan Quranic verses kan. It's not our way. Kalau cara macam tu, kalau siapa buat, it's not actually not advisable lah, ya. Sebab bila teori sains berubah tu, macam mana kita main buat. Tapi secara minimum macam kita ambil kan, macam sebagai macam insight kan, macam sebagai guidance. Jadi Asy'ariyah pun ambil sikap macam tu actually dengan nature ni. Sebab nature pun ada ayat juga. Ini teori about nature ni, Asy'ariyah tidak ambil in total tau. Dia just kasih macam certain axiomatic punya expression aja. Misalnya alam ni discrete, daripada atom dan juga accident. Tidak ada misalnya setiap kerja ini semuanya kuasa Allah, tidak ada sebab wajib. Tapi dia tak buat macam saya sebut dengan saudara yang tadi pagi, macam kosmologi yang kompleks. Kalau siapa biasa misalnya dengan Ibn Sina punya kosmologi, dia akan mula dengan akal pertama Tuhan, lepas tu bawah dia akal pertama, akal kedua, sampai akal ke-10, lepas tu baru bumi. Lepas tu bawah bumi tu nanti ada dipanggil haiwan, kemudian pokok, last sekali batu batan. It's a complex cosmology.
Satu lagi, teori-teori kalam pun boleh berkembang dan berubah ikut apa yang kita faham daripada apa yang kita dapat daripada pencerapan empirical.
Implikasinya kalau kosmologi itu salah, dia akan reflect, maknanya the whole philosophy itu wrong. Sebab itu kalam maintain dia punya minimum kind of spekulasi, tapi dia sangat critical, logik tu. Yang Dr. Masal cakap pasal spekulasi lebih logik. Kalam memang isi pada logical explanation, axiom, statement.
Sorry, saya lihat ada similarity pendekatan ni, contohnya cara agama Buddha dan juga sains, Confucianism dan juga sains, macam totally Buddha dan sains kan.
Buddha macam mana?
So sebab Buddha dia dekat dengan sains, apa-apa pun dia akan gunakan scientific evidence sebagai untuk proof.
Buddha?
Ya, tak tahulah, ini limited. Itulah, so saya notice yang tu. It's just pendekatan, belum content. So saya boleh bezakan pendekatan dengan content.
Ya, saya rasa mana-mana agama yang tidak ambil pengertian metafisik yang terlampau tebal, terlampau loaded, dia akan fleksibel. Kan? Kalau siapa yang pegang metafisik yang sangat kompleks, dia akan susah menghadapi perubahan tu. Itu maksudnya.
Ya, sebab kita tahu nature science pun is like sentiasa berubah, progresif dan sebagainya. Kalau kita tahu the nature tu, kita akan selamat lah dengan agama masing-masing lah.
Okay. Dan itu pun poin penting sebab Prof. Osman Bakar, dia antara pada pendapat dia, kenapa Islamization of knowledge tak berjaya setakat ini adalah kerana kita terlalu territorial. Kita nak cakap tentang Islam saja dan sains. Kalau kita dapat buka kemungkinan untuk melibatkan pemegang-pemegang agama lain untuk bina satu sintesis yang boleh melawan paradigma secularism untuk kita letakkan sains. Maksudnya, when people think about science, they're not thinking about secularized humanist way of looking at the world anymore. They're thinking about the world is part of the creation of God. So if we can have that, pergerakan Islamization of science tu akan ada kebarangkalian untuk berjaya. That's totally different talk, different lecture.
Yeah, okay. But what is metaphysics?
Yes. Okay. So the second question is a very short one. We just want to look at how is it possible for the ideas of the mutakallimun could have flown into Europe and reached the Cartesians. So there are 4 possible channels. The first one is through Ibn Rushd, right? So, for example, in the works of Ibn Rushd, in the Latin translation of Ibn Rushd's work, they talk about loquentes, which means those who are speaking, which basically means the mutakallimun. So they say that the loquentes considered God to be the only agent acting without any intermediaries, and that they say the fire does not burn and bread does not satisfy hunger. So the point here is the Cartesians could have reached the conclusion that they reached based on their study of works by people like Ibn Rushd. And another big work, another significant work by Ibn Rushd that is important to mention here is Tahafut al-Tahafut, which is his refutation on Al-Ghazali's magnum opus Tahafut al-Falasifa. So because in Tahafut al-Tahafut, Ibn Rushd mentions the ideas that Al-Ghazali holds, and Al-Ghazali is the key figures of the Mutakallimun. So if the Cartesians read works of Ibn Rushd, they would have learned about how the Mutakallimun thinks, because Ibn Rushd is attacking the ideas of the Mutakallimun. Okay? So for example, I think we've mentioned this before, that Al-Ghazali has a different way of looking at potentiality and possibility and necessity. So kita tak payah ulang lagi. Alright. So that's one example. And I think another point is that one of the objection is, so if it is possible for a block of wood to be a computer screen, does it mean that anything can be converted into a computer screen? Is it possible that suddenly we can fly, right? So the objection is, it seems that the Mutakallimun is opening the door of possibility too wide, and that can cause problem for you to believe in ridiculous things. So the answer to that is, God doesn't do that regularly. There is a continuous habit, istimrar al-ada. There is a custom of God, the sunnatullah, where the universe is operating in a very regular and orderly way. So if they ask the Mutakallimun, is it possible for the block of wood to become a computer screen? Or is it possible for me to fly? So the answer is yes, but unlikely, because it is against the Sunnatullah. That happens, if God wants that to happen, it can happen as a miraculous event, not as something, not as a natural phenomenon. Okay. So number 1 is through Ibn Rushd. Another route.
Okay, ni ayat tambah. Ini penting ya. That's why nampak ini yang berlaku confusion. Actually, memang the West baca buku Ibn Rushd. That is the fact, because they follow Aristotle. Tahafut. Contohnya, bisa tahafut. Bisa tahafut Al-Ghazali. Tahafut ni tak betul tebal. Tahafut. Kind of the reputation of the philosopher, Al-Ghazali. Ibn Rushd kemudian tulis tahafut al-tahafut, lagi tebal. Actually, dia tebal sebab apa? Sebab dia quote Al-Ghazali banyak. You see? Ni cara mutakallimun ataupun sekolah zaman dulu menulis, dia akan quote verbatim. Jadi mungkin kita boleh dapat mungkin 1/3 daripada tahafud ni ada dalam ni. You see? Jadi bila orang baca tahafud, orang memang baca Ibn Rushd, tapi dia ambil idea Al-Ghazali. You see tak the problem here? People got Al-Ghazali through Ibn Rushd, dan people attribute Ibn Rushd yang punya idea. This is the problem. You got the problem? Actually, okay, we must know the background. Ibn Rushd is basically Aristotelian, percaya kepada cause and effect yang wajib, percaya pada alam ni block universe, which basically the West reject. Yeah. Pada Dewan ni abad ke-12, abad ke-14 dia dah mula reject. Pada jam dekat dah memang dia dah tolak. Contoh misalnya idea Hume, kita sebut causality. This actually idea Ghazali. So maknanya Ibn Rushd ni mendapat nama disebabkan Ghazali punya idea dalam buku dia yang dia cuba refute. Tetapi at the end people ambil idea Ghazali itu sendiri, tapi dia tak pernah dapat kredit. Dia tak the how history boleh be misleading. Dan contoh yang saya beri jelas, idea katakan atomism. Ibn Rushd tak percaya atomism sebab dia Aristotle kan. So how can Ibn Rushd menyumbang atomism dekat Western thought? Cannot. Walaupun saya tahu ada buku yang nuliskan ni dipanggil Averroes Atomism. Late his life, Averroes juga percaya pada atomism. That's a book actually. Tapi itu bisa small lah dia punya influence kan. Jadi to show is when people say Ibn Rushd banyak memberi sumbangan kepada pemikiran di Eropah, actually statement tu is misleading. Sebab idea yang diambil itu idea mutakallimun Asy'ariyah, especially Al-Ghazali. Tapi disebab ditulis dalam buku Ibn Rushd, mereka attribute kepada Ibn Rushd. Because the West actually reject Ibn Rushd. Because dia anggap Ibn Rushd ni merosakkan faham Kristian. Dan in fact dia decree pun. Sebab Ibn Rushd bagi terus kepada dua komponen kan, kebenaran untuk orang awam dan kebenaran untuk ahli agama. Jadi dia panggil double truth movement. Ibn Rushd punya idea. So basically, selagi Aristotle diterima di barat, Ibn Rushd mendapat tempat. Bila Aristotle ditolak, automatically Ibn Rushd tertolak. That benda yang kita kena juga fahamkan masyarakat ya, bahawa sebenarnya yang idea yang diterima lebih banyak dominan sebenarnya datang pada Asy'ariyah dan Ghazali, bukan Ibn Rushd.
Oh, yang ni yang kaitan dengan teori Al-Ghazali ni memusnahkan sains Islam.
Ya.
Yes.
Ya, ini dia punya hujah yang saya nak cuba bantah ni. Sebab kata dia, kalau Islam tiru Ibn Rushd, dah lama dia maju dalam sains. Sebab kita tiru Ghazali lah kita jadi lemah dalam sains.
Ya, sebab Al-Ghazali waktu dia banyak betulkan tentang ahli falsafah.
Okey, Ghazali misalnya attack Ibn Rushd, ahli falsafah pasal causality. Ibn Rushd memang ahli falsafah tak boleh jawab. Kan? Hume ambil idea Ghazali. Jadi maksud saya kita kena letak Ibn Rushd ni pada tempat dia. Dan kita kena tahu Ghazali ni dudukannya yang betul, supaya kita tidak apa yang sebut mitos. Saya panggil mitos Al-Ghazali sebagai punca kelemahan berfikir umat Islam ni masih kuat. Jadi kita kena faham, maknanya memang idea tu datang melalui buku-buku Ibn Rushd, tapi quotation ni tentang Ghazali. Ini penting ya. Okay.
Satu lagi faktor adalah time gap tu, sebab can you imagine Al-Ghazali like 11th century, so Descartes is 17th century, so like 500 tahun kan. And in the past diorang tak ada internet, so diorang tak tahu pun apa yang diorang baca tu adalah berasal daripada idea Al-Ghazali 500 tahun dulu.
Dia jadi macam common knowledge ya.
Yes.
Jadi
I think in practice kepentingan benda yang Dr. Amran cakap ni adalah bila kita, terutama bila kita berdepan dengan Muslims yang very religious, bila dengar je, oh ni idea siapa? Ini idea David Hume. David Hume siapa? Orang barat. Kita tak nak dengar idea dia. Right? So we have to point out to them that sometimes the ideas that the West are using is not coming from the West. It comes from the Muslim scholars. So just because the ideas seems to come from Western names, you have to look at it to see whether it's consistent with the way we believe.
Ya betul. Macam sekarang ni kita bercakap pasal nak mengembangkan sains. Adakah kita nak mula daripada zaman Musina, ataupun we take up daripada modern science sekarang, dia top up kan? That the whole idea. Kalau kita ada sikap negatif ataupun hostile kepada Barat semata-mata sebab dia bukan Islam, I think we cannot go anywhere. So now we see that the idea tu berkesinambungan kan, dan kita tahu Barat tu pun banyak daripada idea orang Islam. So we just improve ataupun sambung apa yang dia buat kan, daripada kita nak mula bila tak tahu nak mula masalah, nak mula Musina ke, nak mula lepas Ghazali ke, then you have to go back for 500 years. It's impossible. Dan sedangkan kita tahu idea Asy'ariyah adalah yang sekarang ni basically menjadi macam general idea of the science atau misal indeterministic world kan. Nah, ini saya ingat orang yang saya perasan, orang memang kagum bahawa kita hidup dalam chaos kan. Biasanya dalam ibu ahli motivasi pun disebut kan, management anyway lah, we are living in the changing, ever changing world, we are living in the indeterministic world kan. Ini macam jadi slogan kan. But basically Asy'ariyah punya conception, the world are indeterminate, you cannot predict the world kan. In the sense memang chaotic lah, in the sense. Sebab apa yang Asy'ariyah buat ialah to reject is basically deterministic world yang basically proposed by Aristotle. Exactly yang Ghazali tiba promote in the indeterminate world ni. So maksud saya, pemikiran sains semasa ini sebenarnya sangat rapat dengan Asy'ariyah. Cuma how Muslim nak masuk tu lah, nak pick up untuk mana. That basically yang kita nak beritahu kepada saintis. Ini mereka perlu untuk rasakan mereka ada ownership, ada confidence untuk contribute more direct tentang hubungan mereka punya agama misalnya.
We have to write our own textbooks.
Yeah.
That's one of the things I think.
Yeah, we should try.
Sebab kalau sekarang pun even in universities, when we want to study science, we buy the ones from the US and the UK, even though it's very, very expensive, and the things that they teach is just the things that we already kind of know. Yeah, anyway,
Okay.
So the first channel was Ibn Rushd. The second channel is through Moses Maimonides. So Moses Maimonides is a Spanish scholar also. He's a Jew, but he wrote a lot in Arabic. And in one of his book, The Guide for the Perplexed, he kind of detailed the ideas of the Mutakallimun. So for example, all things are composed of atoms. Time is composed of atomic units. There is vacuum. So if the Cartesians read the works of Maimonides, they would have encountered the ideas of the Mutakallimun. These are the explanation. So for example, Maimonides give an example that the Mutakallimun believe that when cloth comes into contact with indigo, with ink or dye, it becomes dark blue. And God creates the blueness of the cloth upon contact with the indigo. So it's not the indigo itself that caused the changes of color. Alright, so that's number 2. The third possible route of transmission is the scholastics.
I should add sikit ni yang Maimonides ni. Kalau you tengok dia pada pusat kata 12 ni, sebenarnya principle dia. How Asy'ariyah basically revolutionize Aristotle punya view. Konsep. This is like dia punya axiom ya. Maimonides buat dalam berapa 12 proposition. This is like 12 axiom ya, 12 dia panggil principle ya. All things are composed of atom. Totally reject Aristotelian punya paradigm. You see? Maknanya this bukan from Asy'ariyah. There is vacuum. This is important. Dekat tak kira vacuum kan. See? These are what we call nowadays in science we call axiom, or you call theory, or you call hypothesis. So you see how I mean detail and scientific dia punya proposition. I mean logical dia. Ini Maimonides tulis abad ni tahun 12 sampai abad ke-12 ya. Abad ke-12 you see. So abad ke-12 lagi Asy'ariyah, idea Asy'ariyah cuba ubah pemikiran Aristotle tu dah sampai di barat. Ya. Cuma mereka boleh betul-betul tolak tu selepas scientific revolution tu pada abad ke-17. Mana 500 tahun mereka nak digest the idea dalam boleh understand how paradigm is a very powerful, the scientific paradigm yang existing. Dan yang masuk maknanya abad ke-12 lagi dah sampai ke mereka. Dan kalau kita boleh tengok teks yang original, kita tahu ni it's totally against the existing paradigm. Sebab pada waktu ini Ibn Sina masih berpengaruh, Ibn Sina, Aquinas, Di barat idea ini hanya boleh terima pada abad ke-14 bila mereka mula menolak Aquinas punya sintesis yang seperti Aristotle itu abad ke-14 oleh Occam, So this benda yang kita should appreciate sebenarnya, how very kita very advanced, we can say very advanced, very early. Tapi hari ini Muslim tak nak berkenaan saintifik pun, tak rasa perlu berkenaan saintifik ataupun masuk dalam dunia sains. Kan kita kan ada masalah kan, orang tak nak belajar sains ni, budak-budak ni semua nak buat bisnes lah apa ni.
Betul, dia sebab-sebab lain. Saya kita bincang kat UPM juga. Antara sebab kita tak berapa, sekarang kan kita tak rasa macam semangat nak promote sains dekat pelajar-pelajar sebab pasaran kerja tak semestinya ada. So kita tak nak macam janji-janji sangat kalau ke belajar sana awak akan dapat kerja. Tak semestinya.
Bila betul lah, betul. Waktu kejayaan itu penting.
Tapi penting lah, macam maksudnya apa yang kita nak untuk kita punya perbincangan ni adalah supaya orang yang peduli agama dia berminat nak belajar tentang sains. Orang yang peduli sains nak berminat tentang belajar tentang agama. Betul kan?
Ya, betul. Tak, maksudnya regardless lah katakan commercial tu memanglah carry, tapi scientific spirit tu dah ada dalam Muslim. Orang dia kata dia syairah, berarti dia ada scientific spirit dah. Kan kalau ikut syairah ni, alam ni tiba ada atom. Maknanya kalau orang tu kata dia belajar sebab 20, dia rasa scientific spirit tu. Tapi ini tak ada pun. Dia jadi lebih radikal ke lain pula kan. Salah. Okay, please.
Okay, so the third channel is from the scholastics. So scholastics are the Christian scholars who are very influential between the 12th century and 17th century. So for example, one of them is Saint Thomas Aquinas. So Saint Thomas Aquinas wrote in his book Summa contra Gentiles, and he mentioned that these Loquentes believe that fire does not heat, and it is God who causes heat in the presence of fire. So that's basically the idea of the Mutakallimun. And when he wrote about this, it doesn't mean that he actually accepted, because Aquinas seems to reject the occasionalism. So according to Aquinas, the creations have the power to make change, right? So he gives an image of an artist with a brush with a canvas. So when the artist trying to paint something on the canvas, the brush is the secondary cause and the artist is the primary cause. So they call this concurrentism, meaning that the causal powers come concurrently from the primary cause, which is God, and the secondary cause, which is the object in the world. But other scholastic scholars, such as William of Ockham, he is very skeptical about the existence of this secondary cause, because he says, so if God can actually do alone whatever the secondary causes can do on their own. So fire can cause heat, but God can cause heat without fire. So if that's the case, why do you need to put the secondary cause as part of your metaphysical explanation, right? So he's one of them. William of Ockham, another one is Portugal Coe, the other one is Gabriel Bill. So the point here is, these scholastic scholars, they discuss about all of these causalities and modalities, and they use arguments that have a very similar structure with the ones that has been developed by the Mutakallimun. So if the Cartesians were to read the works of the scholastics, they would have been aware with the ideas of the Mutakallimun. Okay, and finally, last one is the French and Dutch Orientalists. So by the 16th century, there is an upsurge of interest in the ideas from the Islamic world. So for example, the French King Francis I, he appointed professors of Arabic in a university in France. And also the Dutch government appoint another one, a professor. They even have the Oriental Studies department in University of Leiden, right? And this is a good possible link because they are, for example, Professor Jacob Gaulius, who is a professor of mathematics at the University of Leiden, he is a teacher of René Descartes. So it is possible that Descartes learns about the ideas of the Mutakallimun through his contact with his teacher and his good friend Jacob Gaulius. And Jacob Gaulius, he traveled to Islamic lands. He went to Morocco, Aleppo, Istanbul, and he brought back over 300 Arabic, Turkish, and Persian manuscripts. And they actually know the books that he bought because they have this, University of Leiden has this Gaulius collection, which is the books that he bought for the university's library. So we know that Gaulius is aware of the Mutakallimun's idea, and if Descartes studied with him and he really was his good friend, I'm sure that Descartes is exposed to the ideas of the Mutakallimun as well. And finally is Richard Simon, who is a biblical scholar. So Richard Simon is a biblical scholar, so he will be aware of the work of Maimonides and Ibn Rushd. And Richard Simon is the teacher of Nicolas Malebranche, one of the major Cartesians. So I think that's it. So I guess we can summarize, because the rest of the chapter he's trying to demonstrate the link between the Cartesian and the Mutakallimun in more details. I guess we can go to the conclusion. So one of the conclusion is there is parallels and continuities between the Ash'arite and the Cartesians. So this observation is important because for quite a long time Al-Ghazali was considered the enemy of philosophy and rationality. In fact, there was one time my brother Alif, he sent me a YouTube videos, a talk by Neil deGrasse Tyson. So he's a very, very popular astronomer. So he in that talk he talks to people why the Muslims have very few Nobel Prize winners, very few contribution to science. So he says because of Al-Ghazali. So if you know him, he's a very, very influential science communicator. So when he says something like that, will be millions of young people who will accept that as truth. So it's the things that Dr. Amran and the ISSI work is very important to change that paradigm. Right, so let me summarize. So conclusion. So we addressed two questions today. The first one is what are the similarities between the Cartesians and the Mutakallimun. So we see that there are lots of similarities and some important differences in at least four concepts: causality, modality, laws of nature, and atomism. And then the second question is how did the ideas of the Mutakallimun could have reached the intellectual milieu of the Cartesians? So the answer is through Maimonides, through Ibn Rushd, through the scholastics, and through the Dutch and French professors of Arabic and Oriental studies. All right. So I guess if there is one message that you can take home, because people will ask you where were you this morning, and you can say that I came to this talk about Kalam and science, and they might ask you what do you learn. You can say something like, I learned that when we do science today, we're actually practicing the philosophy that was developed by scholars in the past, and sometimes more far back than what would have expected, right? So if you talk to science students today, and they might not be aware that when they go to the labs and do the experiments, they would have known that what they do is actually a product of an idea that was developed by Ibn Haytham or Cartesians or the Mutakallimun like hundreds and hundreds of years ago. So the reason we want to continue this intelligent discussion, to read books like this, to have this discussion, is not for nostalgic purpose. It's not so that we can go out and say, "Wow, look at how clever Muslim scholars in the past." That's not the point. The point is we have this great Kalam tradition, which is a rational framework that is embedded in our Aqidah. And it has the resources, the methodological resources and the philosophical resources for it to be applied to our advancement in science and technology. So I hope all of us can support what Dr. Amran is working on. Let's pray for him, and inshallah at some point we will have a generation of scientists. When they study science, they understand that what they're studying is actually Sunnatullah, the custom of God. So when you study the custom of God, you actually are studying an aspect of the divine, and because of that, that study is an ibadah. That's it. Assalamu alaikum.